Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast. We cover everything Major League, from spring training to the World Series. We've got your favorite club covered, from New York to Boston to LA. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast.
Hello and welcome into another edition of the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Kevin Mahalik, and this is episode number 199 of the Baseball Podcast here on Monday, June 22nd. We'll start out today's episode by wishing a happy Father's Day to all the fathers out there listening. Hopefully you enjoyed the weekend. You enjoyed the day yesterday. It was a beautiful weather weekend here in Philadelphia. I was able to get outside, spend Saturday with my father, hanging out, just enjoying the day, enjoying each other's company. And then Sunday, spent some time with my 2.5-year-old and the family. It was a great day. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the weekend out there as well. If you were able to get together in person with your dad, good for you. I know there's some people out there with the COVID-19 and the coronavirus. They have yet to kind of be able to gather, and local hotspots popping up. So hopefully everybody out there was safe, but hopefully you spent some time with your dad. And if you weren't able to get together in today's world, you were able to Zoom, FaceTime, whatever it is, send your well wishes and send your thank yous to all the fathers out there. So welcome in once again. I appreciate it. The GSMC Baseball Podcast. We're going to do a little bit of a makeover. Instead of the 6-10-minute segments, we are now moving forward, going to have 4 15-minute or so segments. It is going to be the same length. No problem there for everybody listening, freaking out. We're going to be on the same days. You guys will be able to listen to this podcast every Monday and Thursday. We're just going to cut down on the number of segments, make the segments a little longer as we continue to evolve. We continue to improve here at the GSMC Podcast Network with over 17 million downloads across the entire network in the month of May. If you guys haven't yet searched the podcast network, please do so. I know you're a baseball fan listening to this podcast, but if you're into football, soccer, baseball, or maybe it's news, politics, movies, music, books, whatever it is, I believe there's 32 shows in the podcast network. I may be off by a show or two there, but if you're into any of those, check it out. Go to GSMC Podcast. If you're on Apple Podcasts, type it into the search bar, Spotify, wherever you're listening to your podcast. Make sure you give us a like and a follow, a subscribe, whatever it is on that platform. Give us a 5-star rating, write a review. We really appreciate it out there, and we appreciate you guys, the listeners, as we continue to grow, both within the podcast network and the GSMC Baseball Podcast. So, jumping right into it now, right off the top, giving you guys an update on what's going on in the labor negotiations. I know this conversation tends to drag on, talking about it twice a week for an extended amount of time. But here, as we're inching closer to the deadline, we're inching closer to a resolution. Once again, as of time of recording here on Sunday evening, there's even been some changes to the timeline or what could potentially happen moving forward. So, again, where we are right now is Major League Baseball rejected the counter proposal of 70 games from the Players Association and have pretty much said 60 games is as high as we are going to go, which in turn really leaves the players with two options. And one is you accept the 60-game proposal. Maybe you make a few changes to it, but ultimately you accept the proposal and you play that much. Or two, you decline the proposal, you make Rob Manfred mandate a season, ultimately you file a grievance, and this just continues into ultimate all-out chaos all-out battles, but all the way into the 2021 labor negotiations that are still coming, and we may see this exact movie play out once again in a year or two for those negotiations. But so Sunday, the players were set to vote on whether or not they were ultimately going to accept the 60-game proposal. But as Sunday continued to go on, nobody had heard anything regarding a player vote, and then reports started to surface and started to come out that the players are postponing the vote for the time being. One, in response to the coronavirus outbreaks that have taken place at spring training facilities. We're going to talk about that in much more detail coming up in the second segment. But two, there are, let's see here, how can I word this? Cautious optimism, and I'm doing air quotes. I know you guys can't see me out there, but cautious optimism as the talks have continued between the two parties well into the afternoon on Sunday evening. And what does this essentially mean? It means ultimately at the heart of this proposal and the heart of what could potentially be an agreement is the 60 games at fully prorated pay. Now, the players understand that if they accept this proposal, they're going to be looked at as potentially losing the negotiation. Now, in my opinion, the general court of public has already determined that both of these parties are losers. The owners are going to lose. The players are going to lose. Nobody's going to look good when this agreement happens. They're not going to say, oh, the players won that one. Way to go. Round of applause. Or, hey, way to go, owners. This is what you wanted. The fan and the public appeal has essentially determined this is a losing outcome no matter what. But still internally, from a players association, from a leadership perspective, with Tony Clark, he's ultimately continuing to battle for his job. As I said, there's another negotiation coming up within the next 18 months. That if he doesn't perform admirably or if he doesn't perform well with this current negotiation, why would we trust him to run that future negotiation in the future? It's a whole entire conversation internally happening with the players that, okay, if we do agree to the 60 games, we're going to need to win other segments elsewhere. Or Tony Clark is going to need other quote-unquote wins to go back to his players to say, hey, continue to trust me because, yes, we're playing only 60 games, but I got you XYZ involved moving forward. And again, as of Sunday evening, there's been no vote within the Players Association. There is optimism that another air quotes here, a modified proposal could be presented Monday from the owners to the players. This in turn talks about all of these little details or little negotiations that the players and owners are continuing to work through. It's even some of the small minuscule details that really don't matter in the huge outcome of the financial crisis that we are in, but there's a few little tidbits coming out about a potential agreement or some of the conversation that is happening behind closed doors, and one of them is in regards to extra innings and a modification that will be implemented here in 2020 and potentially moving forward, but certainly just agreed upon for 2020 only at this point. And that is in the regular season, if there is a 2020, not in the postseason of 2020, but an extra inning starting in the 10th inning, there will be a runner on base. Now, I do believe it's first base. There wasn't an exact specification put on which base it would be. I can't imagine that they would go right to second base and do the softball or the AAU rules back when you had a time limit on the games and how long they could run. So if you put a guy on first base in the 10th inning, this is something that the players are actually talking about, because the players are concerned about these long extra inning games. They're concerned about potentially being exposed for an extended period of time. And this is why they're pushing for some sort of change to the extra inning, the way it's set up, because even they're talking about being able to re-enter the game. They're talking about freebies when it comes to substitutions, maybe when you hit the 11th or 12th inning. If you had pinch hit earlier or made a defensive substitution earlier, and now you're only down to pitchers, and we've seen it time after time after time in the regular season where a rotational pitcher who isn't isn't throwing the day before or the next day is now the pinch runner in extra innings because he's faster than the first baseman, and they're really looking to end the game here in the bottom of the 15th because Ryan Howard has just made it to second base and he can't even move anymore. Or Albert Pujols is now on second base with 2 outs in the 15th. You got Trout up, so you're going to run for Pujols hoping that Trout can get a base knock and get him in. So I'm curious as to how this could affect extra inning games. I don't have the statistics in front of me, but one question I am asking myself is the percentage of the amount of times that people score in an inning with a runner on first base and nobody out as opposed to, nobody on and nobody out. What that statistical advantage is moving forward, I would assume it wouldn't be exponential. It wouldn't go from 40% or 10% to 40%, team scoring 10% of innings, but if a guy's on first, it's 40%. But sometimes that leadoff walk can really start a rally. But if you just throw a guy out there and the pitcher just keeps dealing again, rolls a double play, boom, you're out of the inning. So certainly it won't lead to an expected, run scored every inning, but I do think you won't get that 16, 17, 18 inning marathon anymore, which is obviously what the players are concerned about. It's the exposure, the length of time, the short turnaround and short travel time for all of these games, because as we continue to move day by day here, the window gets a little bit smaller each time in regards to the amount of potential games that they really could play. But each day that goes by is also a small victory for the owners, because they truly, since the outset of this outbreak and even since the March agreement, feels like they've only wanted to give up a certain amount of money to play baseball this summer. We've seen it through their 3 or 4 proposals. Each proposal has really offered the players the same amount of salary. It was more games at less salary. Now it's less games at a full proration, but 60 at 100 proration, or the initial one, I think at 80 some games and a stacked tier to the proration, was ultimately the same amount of money out of the owners' pockets. And clearly this number is not above 60. So that's where you start to look at the amount of days, break it down by 7 for weeks. You're looking at 9 weeks, 63 days. They're definitely going to look at 10 weeks, because if you're going to have 60 games, you're obviously going to need an off day in there somewhere, potentially once a week. So if you're looking at 60 games in 70 days, you're going to need 10 weeks to start the season, and they don't want to start it since the end of September. So now you're trailing back 4 weeks into the month of August, now July, then in the end of June, and here we are. So this is where now the time frame day by day starts to align more and more with what the owners want, and each day that goes by is obviously a penalty against the players and their aspirations of playing the most amount of games possible. Every day that goes by, it can't happen. And with the coronavirus outbreak, without getting into the detail and spoiling our second segment, this is a win for the owners. Nobody's ever going to come out and say that from the ownership perspective. And I don't know if saying something like that could get me in trouble, but this is a win for the owners. They're not going to put anybody's health at risk. Obviously, they're getting everybody out, taking all their precautions and cleaning. But behind the scenes, I'm sure there's a few conversations happening that are, hey, we're going to have to pause spring training anyway. The players gave us a proposal that started spring training on June 29th. Well, that's not going to happen anymore. They're going to take at least a week to 2 weeks to clean out the facility. So now we're ultimately into July. So the first day we could come back after this recent outbreak now aligns perfectly with their 60 games that they're trying to get involved. And I think that really is one of the main reasons why we're starting to get momentum here. I was coming through the weekend. We talked about Thursday. It's into Friday, into Saturday. Nothing had really happened. We hadn't seen any tweets. We hadn't seen any reports, any articles about conversation. There was a counter proposal. And then the owners came back and they were upset. But ever since then, it was really crickets and silence on both sides. And all of a sudden, Sunday morning, murmurs start to come out that they're communicating. There's going to be a vote on the players' side because it's either, hey, 60 games at this amount of money, or Manfred mandates the year. People are still talking about that could be 50 to 52 games. We've talked about it at length in the past about how the postseason then becomes affected at that point. It's now 4 or 5 teams on each conference as opposed to 8. Postseason revenue is spread out differently, and it's just, oh God, you can't do that. Right now, where we're at here, with the end of June, with what's going on in America, with the coronavirus around the country, we've had hot spots in Florida, we've had hot spots in Arizona, we continue to try to battle it, people continue to try to file for unemployment. Finally, this past weekend, I honestly felt a bit of normalcy for the first time in a long time, not even in related to baseball, but just sports in general. We had the Belmont Stakes on Saturday. We had a horse race for the first time. Normally it's the third leg of the Triple Crown. Well, now it was the first leg of the Triple Crown. So that was back live, and that was fun to watch, and that was exciting and started to make it feel like summertime. Then we had golf back here Sunday night, started to record right after the RBC Heritage, coming down 18. Guy needed a birdie to tie, missed the putt, ultimately loses by 1. Webb Simpson gets the victory. America in sports are slowly trying to get back to normalcy, slowly trying to get back on the field or back on the court as soon as possible. And baseball, having already quote-unquote missed their window of being the first sport back, it now feels like all of that was foolish conversation, because at the heart of this, since this had started, with the amount of money that the owners are losing every game, we now know 80 games was never going to happen. 100 games was never going to happen. They were going to delay, stall tactics, whatever it took to get the number down to 60 games and the amount of money that they're truly willing to pay. So hopefully by Thursday's episode, we'll have an agreement for you for episode number 200. I'm feeling lucky. The bicentennial episode, it's going to be the one where we're actually talking about agreement. We're talking about set dates. We're talking about specifics in the return. We're talking everything Major League Baseball getting back on the field. Whether it's the agreement or Rob Manfred, it certainly seems that by Thursday, we're definitely going to have quality conversation to have. But that'll wrap it up here for the first segment of the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. As always, I am your host, Kevin Mahalik, and this is episode number 199 of the Baseball Podcast. We're going to pause right now for a word from one of our sponsors, one of our sister shows, but when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more detail about the outbreaks in coronavirus and ultimately what this could mean for the rest of the summer moving forward. Stick around, guys. We'll be right back.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Welcome back, and thanks for listening to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Kevin Mahalik, and this is episode number 199 of the Baseball Podcast. We're getting to the bicentennial. It's happening this Thursday. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, welcome in. We appreciate the new listeners. We welcome you every episode. As the family grows, we very much appreciate it. If you're a father, happy Father's Day to you out there. Welcome. We're having ourselves a good time. But I'd be remiss if I don't ask you, please leave a 5-star rating wherever you're listening to the podcast. Write a review. If it's Apple Podcasts, just scroll up a little bit, hit the 5 stars. It's the star all the way on the right. Make it easy, and then you'll also see in purple, write a review, hit 5 stars, write what you'd like. We appreciate it. A few episodes ago, we had some new reviews to read, but it doesn't look like anything happened this weekend. It was Father's Day out there, so I'll cut you guys a break. But if you guys could continue to leave reviews, that goes a long way for helping us spread the word of the Baseball Podcast, as well as continue to grow within the entire podcast network. But we talked about the latest in negotiations between the players and owners in the first segment, and now we're talking in a little bit more detail. We teased it in the first segment, but there is the quote-unquote coronavirus outbreak across Major League Baseball that has happened here in the past couple of days, and it's very consistent to what we are seeing across the country in regards to COVID-19 and quote-unquote hot spots that are popping up all over the country. And the team that broke the news, near and dear to my heart here, is the Philadelphia Phillies. It came out at the start of the weekend, Friday, I believe it was, that 5 players and 3 workers had tested positive at the Clearwater spring training facility. Now, none of the players' names have been released or the 3 workers, but continuing to talk to people around the team, continuing to listen to the insiders, there is still the possibility of more positive tests being released, because these 8 were 8 of 40 that were still tested and waiting results. So they had gotten these back, and they're waiting on the additional 32 results. Now, they're not going to be known to the public immediately, but of course you don't think it's going to be 0 out of 32 based on these other 8 additional positive tests. So more players, more workers could and probably will be testing positive for the coronavirus within the clubhouse there. This was the first initial shock or awe or wave across America Friday within the MLB world, across America's baseball fans at least out there. Then it came out not long after that, the New York Yankees had 4 workers at their facilities test positive. I don't believe any players for the Yankees tested positive yet, but 4 workers did. And the correlation between the Phillies and the Yankees they are both in the greater Tampa area. The city of Tampa has recently decided to become a hot spot itself with the weather and the open restrictions down there in the state of Florida. The Yankees and Phillies, their facilities very close to each other. They have the quote-unquote outbreak, which then spread over the weekend. The Blue Jays had a player showing signs of symptoms. They were waiting on test results for that individual, but due to that, they shut down their facility, and everybody who was involved or could have been quote-unquote exposed to that player was sent home and quarantined for the near future until they received the results. The Blue Jays also down there in Florida. The Astros in Florida had 1 player come out and test positive for COVID-19. I talked to my source within the Astros organization. Not a ton of players are back in Florida yet, so it's not one of the big dogs, or at least that's what I've heard. I don't know who it is. But some of the guys I've talked to, they're fine. They're staying away from Florida. They know what's going on. They don't have to report until things become an agreement in spring training 2.0. And now the communication is they may not even have to report back to a spring training location. The Astros have a guy test positive. The Angels have 2 players test positive. That's another organization that is having positive tests and outbreaks since they've reopened the facilities. And then lastly, the Giants have found that they've had players who have been exposed to the virus based on tracing mechanisms or actions on other individuals, and they don't have any current positive tests. But again, based out of precaution, they're shutting down their facility. So because of this, I think I listed 6 teams right there who, after only a week to 2 weeks of opening up their facilities to voluntary workouts, once again, have now seen positive tests. Well, Major League Baseball came out and shut down all facilities for deep cleaning. It doesn't matter if you haven't had a positive test yet, or if you're the Philadelphia Phillies, where you may have an extreme amount of positive tests. Everybody needs to get out of the facilities for at least a week. They're going to need to do deep cleaning. And then in order to return to the facilities, you will need to test negative at least twice, I believe it said, before returning your first time, to try to once again clean out the virus and start from scratch. But this really just puts a light on the fact that the conversations they're having, or the negotiations that they're having, may not matter. The coronavirus or sports in this country, based on its openness, may not be able to correlate. We've watched the KBO. We've talked about the KBO in South Korea. Well, South Korea, once again, is smaller than the state of Florida, and they're a little bit stricter than we are here in America when it comes to their coronavirus precautions. And that's why they haven't had a single positive test in regards to almost over a month now, I believe going on 2 months of their play, because their rules are that if even a single player test positive, the entire league shuts down. It is not put this player in quarantine, everybody else on this team will just skip 2 weeks, maybe they'll come back, we'll test everybody, see how they do, test them again in a couple of days. No, they're shutting the entire thing down. So the players are very serious in their safety, very serious in their precautions, because they know that their paycheck is riding on not testing positive. Not only somebody on their team, but any team in the entire league. And this is a huge thing where the players are coming together to understand the significance and the importance of staying healthy and staying clean, I guess, for lack of a better term. But communicating with players inside of Major League Baseball, sending some texts out to some individuals, getting communication back, not discussing the financials and the agreements, because these guys, believe me, they are sick of talking about it. They are sick of people bothering them. They know that it's time to come to an agreement. They know what's going on in the media. They know they're being run through the ringer. They understand it, but they have their principles. They have their morals. They have their big picture. Everything they need to worry about is somebody who is in it on the day-to-day. They understand a little bit more about what's going on and why specifically they need what they need and why they can't compromise in certain areas to where the public may just say, it's baseball, go play, you're getting paid, come on, what are we talking about? Well, there are people's livelihoods involved. There are houses that were going to be built based on the assumption of some sort of salary that may now not be constructed because the salary will not be to where they thought it was at the beginning of the year. And yes, it sounds like problems that people don't want to hear about, but it's certain people's day-to-day lives. It's if you were in that first person looking in the mirror and this was your life and this was what you were trying to accomplish based on all of your hard work and success, and now it's not happening, you would want to take care of yourself and want to take care of everything that you've been working for. So a lot of the players, that's the communication that's happening, internally is, hey, we know we're not looking great right now in regards to the fans, but there's bigger principles we're standing on. There's some things we're sticking behind. And then I have the conversation around safety and ultimately, hey, how do you feel? And it really comes back to that these guys feel that due to age, due to their health, they understand the risks that are involved. And really here in America, they understand that somebody's probably going to get it, and it could be them. Within the NBA world, we saw the Donovan Mitchell test positive. We saw Rudy Gobert test positive. So these guys know that this is a possibility, but they also understand that a lot of the worst we're hearing isn't in relation to 20-year-olds who are in prime shape or 30-year-olds who are in prime shape physically. Yes, you have those cases or those scenarios out there where people like this have been affected and the worst case has happened. So I don't want to make light or act like that isn't a case. If that's you listening out there and you know someone or it's happened to somebody you're close with, I understand that. But when it comes to the percentages and the possibilities, the players really do understand that, hey, this may be one of those things, but if it happens, that's the risk with the job right now. That's the profession that we are in. And again, they are being paid much more handsomely than the people at the gas station or the people at the grocery store or the people at the pharmacy or the people now back in restaurants. So they understand how America can look at this in that perspective and say, yeah, I'm risking my butt out there. And myself being a salesman from the 9-to-5 world, I'm out there making sales calls to customers. I'm out there exposing myself to customers every day to try to do my job and to try to provide a living for my family. So people feel that players should be able to do this for themselves too and still make what they're making. It's a fascinating conversation for somebody who's kind of in between like myself. I consider myself a fan. I just want to see baseball back as soon as possible, but also somebody who has connections in that world, who knows people who are still playing, who understands what it's like to have that perspective. I get it. So it's tough going back and forth, that's for sure. But this coronavirus outbreak and this delay, again, getting back to the first segment, aligns now with what the owners were looking for moving forward in regards to a time frame for the potential 60-game season. And there was a brief murmur here on Sunday for, an hour to 2 hours in the middle of the afternoon Sunday. If you blinked or you were spending time with your father for Father's Day, you may have not even seen it. But some people were suggesting, due to this coronavirus outbreak, that a bubble could be back on the table in regards to baseball, such as basketball in Orlando. Hockey is looking at 2 remote sites. I believe the leaders in the clubhouse right now are Vegas and Edmonton is what I've heard on hockey side of things. So in regards to baseball, again, we've had the conversation around local revenue and local television rights as to why they can't do a bubble scenario. But some people within baseball, some people within the conversations are just throwing little tidbits in saying, hey, with these outbreaks, with the amount of facilities and the amount of engagement and the amount of interactions that are going to be taking place, if there's 30 teams at these facilities, they're going to the ballpark, then they're going home, maybe they're going to a restaurant, even if they're just getting gas on the weekend. The amount of exposure just increases exponentially if you have to play in home stadiums as opposed to being in a bubble or a quarantined environment. And again, if you're only going for 10 weeks, but then you have the playoffs, so it would still be 12 to 14 weeks, what the players would never do away from their families, away from their extended families, living in a hotel. Basketball and hockey, it's just the postseason, so it's about 6 weeks, which would be doable. That's pretty much just summer camp or getaway camp or studying abroad for 6 to 8 weeks. But when you get to 12, 14, that's a serious move and a serious conversation. So I don't think the players would ever bite on a bubble conversation. And once again, the owners wouldn't, just due to the revenue. But really, in wrapping up this segment, it's just showing you that this coronavirus isn't going anywhere. And even when baseball returns, as safe and as healthy as they can be with the amount of resources that they have, someone is going to test positive. And there hasn't been a ton of conversation out there in the media or out there in regards to these negotiations as to what happens when a player tests positive. Is that entire team quarantined? Are they taken off the schedule for 3 days until other players show symptoms? What are we doing when someone tests positive? Because we've seen now it took 2, 3, 4 weeks to get into the facility. It's ultimately going to happen. It's going to. I know Korea, they've been without a single positive test. We said now 4, 6 weeks here. But with America, with all of the governors on different levels, having different restrictions, different openings, it's going to happen. So that's the second conversation that I'm very excited to have. And the first one, we kind of know it right now, okay? It's going to be 60 games fully prorated. What are those minuscule details that the players may be winning? And then after that, what happens with coronavirus? What happens if somebody tests positive? Are they out for 2 weeks? Do they need to be away for 2 weeks, then a week, come back? What about the taxi squads? What about the minor leagues? Is it the same thing? Are they playing inter squads against each other to stay fresh? How are they handling this potential disease? Because with this recent outbreak, you would think, obviously, Manfred and Tony Clark having these conversations Sunday evening into Monday. This is coming up once again. Hey, financials. But oh, by the way, did we get all this safety stuff right? Did we do everything we need to for coronavirus? Because it's clearly still out there and it's clearly still affecting everything we're doing day to day. But that's going to wrap it up here for the second segment of the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Kevin Mahalik, and we're going to pause right now for a word from one of our sister shows, one of our sponsors. But when we come back, we're going to have a little bit of fun based around Father's Day. We're going to talk about the best father-son duos of all time in Major League Baseball. And there's a few of them up and coming, so this list could change in about 5 to 10 years. It's an interesting one. Hang around.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back, and thanks for listening to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. This is episode number 199 of the Baseball Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Mahalik. It is Monday, June 22nd. I appreciate everybody listening out there. If you haven't followed us on social media yet, please check it out. Head to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Follow the GSMC Baseball Podcast, our Facebook page. We have a few followers there, as well as Twitter. We post recent articles, updates on every episode. If you want to be alerted when the latest podcast has dropped, follow us on social media, as well as subscribe on iTunes. Wherever you're listening to this, hit subscribe. That way it'll show up into your podcast app whenever we release it here on Monday. The moment it's released, boom, it'll be on your phone. Same with Thursday. That way you won't have to keep going searching for it to follow episode to episode here. We very much appreciate you guys doing that. But share it with one of your friends as well out there. I always ask you, just one friend a week. That's it. Just shoot out one text. Take 30 seconds, hit the three little dots. If you're on Apple Podcasts, click share, SMS. Send it to one of your buddies you played baseball with growing up, one of your college buddies who you played fantasy baseball with, somebody else that, from work who likes talking Phillies or baseball, whichever local market you're in. Shoot it to them. Say, hey, check this out. This is quality content. If you do that to just one person a week, we continue to grow and grow. I very much appreciate it. And I can continue to talk into a microphone about baseball and do what I love. I appreciate it once again. But happy Father's Day. I've said it a couple of times now, but once again, in this segment, we're going to have some fun based on Father's Day. A lot of people writing articles out there about the best father-son combos or duos in Major League Baseball history, as well as currently. Some of the future could be coming up here, but diving in, there's a ton of different lists from a ton of different outlets that are being floated around right now, but 1, 2, 3 seem to be pretty unanimous across the board. Starting out with number 1, that of Bobby and Barry Bonds. This was a heck of a combination. Bobby Bonds, diving into his statistics a little bit here for the first 3 or so. Let's see, he played a total of 14 years, 7 for the Giants, and then floated around a ton after that, but 332 career home runs, over 1,000 career RBIs. Let's see here, 461 steals. And then, of course, Barry Bonds, the greatest home run hitter of all time, depending on who you're talking to. 762 career home runs, 73 of them came in one season, 1,996 RBIs, finished 4 short of 2,000 RBIs, played for 22 years, so that's a total of 36 years for the Bonds family in Major League Baseball. 2,558 walks. That's a career high for walks, as well as 688 intentional walks. That's not a career high, a Major League Baseball record high. 762, 2558, and 688 are, all-time highs for Barry Bonds. So that's the number 1 duo when it comes to father-sons in the game of baseball. Number 2, really can't argue with this one either. That's Ken Griffey Sr. and Ken Griffey Jr. Ken Griffey Sr. played for 19 years, 12 in Cincinnati, 2 in Seattle, 5 for the Yankees for his career. Let's see here. He had 152 home runs, 859 RBIs. He hit 296. Definitely not as much of a power hitter as Junior was. That's for sure. Ken Griffey Jr., he played for 22 years, 13 in Seattle, 9 in Cincinnati, 1 for the White Sox. Junior's career numbers, of course, 630 home runs, 1,836 RBIs for Junior. Stolen bases here. He was much better early in his career, only finished with 184, but had like 20 after the year 2000 after he left Seattle. Early on, swiping bags out in Seattle too. But this father-son duo was the only one to play together or famously smacking back-to-back home runs in 1990. Griffey Sr. was on his way out. Griffey Jr. was just coming up. But that's pretty amazing. Father-son combo, back-to-back home runs in the bigs. That's tough to argue with. So, number 3, this is one that you may not get. Only the real diehards out there. You'll probably get it since you're listening to this podcast. But a lot of the common baseball fans out there wouldn't be as well versed, but Felipe Alou and then Felipe Alou and then Moises Alou. Let's see here. Felipe Alou, some of his statistics. He played for 17 years, floated around with the Giants, the Braves, the Yankees. Felipe had 206 home runs, 852 RBIs, had a great career. And then Moises Alou, he was more my time frame. He played for 17 years, played from 90 to 2008. Montreal, the Cubs, Houston, the Mets, all around. Moises, 332 home runs, 1287 in his RBI total there. A really good combination, but Felipe's brothers, Jesus Alou and Matty Alou, both played 15 seasons in the majors, both had a WAR above 20. Their cousin Jose Sosa briefly pitched. Mel Rojas, their nephew. So a family affair in the big leagues for the Alou family. And you start to see more of this pop up as we get later on down the list here. I mean, next up, you got, Sandy Alomar and Sandy Alomar Jr. and Roberto Alomar. If you're taking the top two there, it's Sandy Alomar and Roberto Alomar. But Sandy Alomar, mainly a second baseman, known for his defense and base running, had recorded 227 steals. Again, his two sons, Sandy Alomar Jr. and Roberto Alomar. Sandy becoming Rookie of the Year winner, 6-time All-Star catcher. Roberto, a Hall of Fame second baseman, 12 straight All-Stars, 10 Gold Glove Awards, 67.1 WAR. So the Roberto Alomar, the Alomar family coming in there at number 4 for myself. Next up, I put Cecil and Prince Fielder, just because I loved watching these two humans hit baseballs as far as they possibly can. They were both powerful sluggers, both, and this is pretty amazing after looking at the statistics. And this is a trivia question that not a lot of people out there are going to have the answer to. But both Cecil and Prince finished with exactly 319 career home runs. Cecil was second in the AL MVP voting a couple of times. Prince got over the 50 home run mark. So both of these guys could definitely play, but both of them 319 home runs. Man, that's just, if Prince could have stayed healthy for another week, would he have been able to topple the old man there in the home run ladder? But next up, Cal Ripken Jr., Billy Ripken. Obviously, everybody knows the Ripken family. What happened there? It's the conversation. The old man nowhere near as good as the kid. But let's see here as we continue to move along. We got Tony Gwynn and Tony Gwynn Jr. Everybody knows Tony Gwynn, maybe the best pure hitter since Ted Williams. Some people argue the best pure hitter of all time. He could go out, put that stick on anything. I love watching the highlights on YouTube of him hitting. I was very young when he was in his prime, so I wasn't able to kind of understand the brilliance of Tony Gwynn until you watch some highlights and you just watch him manipulate all 4 quadrants of the strike zone with that bat, and his bat to ball skills are just amazingly impressive. But let's see, Jose Cruz and Jose Cruz Jr. They're up there when it comes to WAR in regards to the top of the list. Jose Cruz, the old man, was a trio of Major League brothers. Hector, his brother, spent 9 seasons in the bigs. Tommy got a cup of coffee a couple of times. Jose played 19 seasons, 13 with the Astros. He's the franchise all-time leader in many offensive categories. I don't have him in front of me, but it says a couple. Let's see here. Hits, stolen bases, triples. He's third in WAR. His son, Jose Cruz Jr., was the 3rd overall pick, had a 12-year career in his own. He had a 30 for 30 campaign, 30 home runs, 30 steals. The Cruz family could let it rip. And then you got Tom Gordon, and D. Gordon is who I have next on the list. And I love Tom Gordon. Flash, back in his Yankee days. I've always been a little bit more of a Red Sox than a Yankees guy, but I love Flash. Going before Mariano Rivera, I appreciated that curveball, that good baseball. No matter where it was, I could certainly watch it. I was a big fan of that. But then also you got D. Gordon, second baseman for the Mariners right now. Steel machine. He was in Florida before that. A good combination there for father and son. Then you got multiple families. You get the Boone family, Ray Boone, Bob Boone, but there's 4 big league Boones, Aaron Boone, that's been across the board, all the Boones, whoever, take your pick. I can't go through all their statistics right now. We'd run out of time, but the Boone family is one that people always talk about, as well as the Bell family, Gus Bell, Buddy Bell, David Bell, Mike Bell. The Bells have the Major League Baseball gene when it comes to the conversation. And then a father-son duo, I didn't know either of them, but Mel Stoudemire and Todd Stoudemire. Father-son duos, it looks like pitchers. The rest of these guys have been position players. There's not a lot of pitchers with this one, but Mel Stoudemire and Todd Stoudemire, both pitchers and both successful pitchers here. Looks like Mel had 4 World Series rings and Todd had 2, if I'm reading this correctly, but very successful on the mound, the Stoudemire father-son duo. But that's everybody in the past. That's everybody up until this point, up until the 2020 season that could really kind of be effective. But now, as we take a glimpse a little bit here into the future, we're looking at that next wave of talent. And this is really kind of my era, where I grew up as the kid watching the dad. And now, yes, the kids are younger than me, but I'm still kind of in their same generation. And I'm talking about Bo Bichette and Dante Bichette with the Toronto Blue Jays. And the Blue Jays, this is very much a thing for them because they have Vlad Guerrero Jr. as well. And I think Vlad Guerrero Jr. and Vlad Guerrero Sr. are going to go down as one of the best home run power hitting father-son duos, very similar to Cecil and Prince Fielder. Maybe not looked at as guys who could hit 300, hit 350, but guys who could certainly launch and lift baseballs. We saw that in the home run derby with Guerrero Jr. putting on a clinic last year. I would expect that to continue a time or two here in the future, or at least I hope he would re-enter the Derby. Obviously not this year with no Derby. Maybe there's one after the World Series. There's rumors of that, but not this year without a Derby, potentially into 2021 and 2022. And then Dante Bichette, I think, is a solid ball player. He's one of those guys that can get under the skin of the opposing team, just frustrate the heck out of you, always doing the little things right, always just kind of getting under your skin, taking an extra base, doing all that good baseball stuff to win games. Then you got Craig Biggio and Kayvon Biggio, I believe is how you pronounce, or Kayvon is how you pronounce the kid's name. I'm not sure there. But obviously Craig Biggio being part of the Killer Bees there in Houston. Second baseman Kayvon, if he can follow in his footsteps and be anywhere near what Craig was, he'll be a ton of fun to watch, as I enjoyed watching Biggio play hard. I remember him getting his 3,000th hit. I believe it was a double where he got thrown out at second. He was trying to extend a single into a double and got thrown out. It was the most anticlimactic 3,000th hit in the history of baseball, in the history of my baseball. That was an interesting one to watch. You got Fernando Tatis Jr. coming up in San Diego. Fernando Tatis Sr., obviously the old man there, but I like him out at shortstop in San Diego. He was on a tear last summer until the injury bug bit him. People are expecting his game to continue to elevate. You have him next to Manny Machado, in between Eric Hosmer, and that lineup offensively should be able to perform, be able to put up runs, and he can continue to develop electric, only at the age of 20 years old now? Probably not even. He's probably still a teenager at this point, but a ton of fun to watch. People are putting money on him being one of the next big things in Major League Baseball. And then one of the last ones and most recent ones is Pudge Rodriguez, Ivan Rodriguez, and his kid Derek. And Derek's actually a pitcher. This is one of the only ones where Pudge, obviously Hall of Fame catcher, one of the most electric arms behind the dish, loved growing up, again, being outside of Dallas in kind of prime Pudge era, watching him throw out runners at second base almost every night, throwing harder down there than the pitcher did into him, was always fascinating to me. The ball would come in at 94 and go out at 98, and I'm like, man, why isn't he just on the mound? And then you saw how he could control the game from behind the dish. Well, the kid, he's on the bump. He's found his way with the Giants. He's now a solid big league contributor. He was struggling to find his way a little bit early on, up and down. Well, he seemed to have found that off-speed pitch. able to mix up locations as well as elevate the fastball, get a little bit of late life on it, and be able to preserve his time in the big. So I don't know if they'll go down as one of the best combos, such as the likes of Guerrero Jr. or Bichette could potentially reach that level, but still fun to watch Pudge's kid out there on the bump, throwing pills, and you can just imagine him pitching back to his dad back in the day for Father's Day. So that'll wrap it up here for the third segment of the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Shout out to all the fathers out there one more time for Father's Day. We love you. Shout out to my old man. I know he's listening. He's a little bit behind sometimes on the podcast, so it may be a week or two from now, but what's up, Dad? Love to give you a shout out here on the pod. But we'll pause now for a word from one of our sponsors, one of our sister shows, and when we come back, we're going to wrap up today's episode talking a little bit about fantasy baseball, what to expect with a short season. Does this change any drafting philosophy? We're going to get into all of that. So stick around, everybody. This is Kevin Mahalik, the GSMC Baseball Podcast. We'll be right back.
Want to know the latest in soccer? Then listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast. From MLS, the World Cup, and the Premier League, we've got you covered. The latest updates, the hottest matches, and news on the league's top players. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast.
David Beckham scores the goal to take England all the way to the World Cup finals.
Listen now.
Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Kevin Mahalik, and this is episode number 199 of the Baseball Podcast here on Monday, June 22nd. Hopefully everybody's enjoying their Monday thus far. If you're listening to this on your ride home from work or your ride to work, whenever you're able to get to this show on Monday, hopefully you're enjoying your day. And if it's Tuesday or Wednesday because it was a busy Monday and you just didn't get to your podcasts that day, that's okay. That's the beauty of podcasts. They are on demand. You can listen at any time. You can pause halfway through. You can come back. That's why we love the podcast world and we love the on-demand audio content here at the podcast network. But if you haven't done so yet, follow us, like, subscribe, rate, review, do all of that stuff. Again, I know I ask you all the time, but it really does help us here. It really does go a long way. Even just taking the few seconds to write a review, I'd be very appreciative and very thankful if you were able to do that for us today. But wrapping up today's show here in the fourth and final segment. In the first segment, we touched on Major League Baseball, the latest in negotiations, where if you're listening to this Monday or Tuesday, there may be an update in regards to an agreement. But as of time of recording here Sunday night, they're continuing to have cautious optimism moving forward that there will be a modified proposal, and I'm doing air quotes, Austin Powers style here behind the microphone and in front of the computer that you guys can't see me doing, but there's talk that we could be gaining traction towards an agreement. A lot of this, I believe, is due to the coronavirus outbreak and the shutdown of the spring training facilities, and now the timeline very much aligns with what the owners are offering with 60 games, and players know now they're only going to get 60 games, so we might as well agree to that and get something elsewhere. We then talked about what the rest of the facilities are doing to clean about the coronavirus, the Phillies, the Yankees, the Astros, all having players test positive. And just last segment, we talked about the best father-son duos in the history of baseball and how some of them may be here in the near future and rewriting some of those record books that the Bonds family or the Griffey family or the Alous family have pretty much put a stamp on at the top of really every list that you see. When you get to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, then you start seeing some discrepancies, but the top three there are tough to argue with, and specifically the top two, that's for sure. But the fourth and final segment here, a little bit of a different segment in regards to the baseball podcast. I myself, I don't claim to be an expert when it comes to fantasy baseball, so we really haven't had much of a conversation around fantasy baseball. Number one, because we didn't know how many games they were going to be, be. We didn't know where the games were going to be. We didn't know who people were going to be playing against. There were just too many unknowns to really dive into a baseball conversation. And I know a lot of you listening to this are going, Kev, we already had our draft. We have our teams played out. This isn't going to help us. What are you doing? Well, in that case, just, fast forward to the end of the episode, leave us 5 stars and act like this next 10 minutes never even happened. But if you're one of those people who's part of the daily fantasy sports, maybe DraftKings, one of those kind of day-to-day games, or if you're looking to add yourself to a late league here like myself, kind of just waiting to see what happens, and then ultimately you want to put your foot in the door. But the fantasy baseball impact of 60 games, it really just comes down to variance in regards to the outcome, because over the course of 162 games, there's going to be 50 game stretches or 60 game stretches where somebody is either locked in or somebody is completely terrible. And you can't predict which 60 game set you're going to get if the season is only 60 games, because over the course of 162, both are going to happen once, and then those final 40 games are really going to determine if he's hot and he has a good year, or if he stinks, he has an okay year, because there's going to be long stretches of slumps as well as hot streaks that you're going to ride. It just happens. And it happens for both hitters and pitchers. And from a pitcher's perspective here, from a fantasy perspective, pitchers typically get about 30 starts on the year. If they're healthy and they're in the rotation every 5 days, it's give or take 30 starts. And again, over the course of 30 starts, you may have 10 starts where you're absolutely lights out. And then you may have 10 starts with an ERA over 5. And the variance is just way too broad to be able to predict what you're going to get in just a 60-game season. I mean, case in point is Matthew Boyd for the Detroit Tigers. If you look at some of the analytics or the sabermetrics, next level statistics, and try to project ultimately what you could get out of him over the course of 60 games, the computer simulation runs everything from the best result of an ERA of 2.02, I think I saw one of the algorithms put together, and then on the worst side, you had an ERA of 5.14. So a 3-run difference to what you could get from Boyd. Now, over the course of 30 starts, double what they're probably going to get this year, where it's looking at potentially 12, 13 starts. You could get 5. Or if you get that in 2 and 5, you put it together, you get an ERA of like 3.7, and that's a good year for Matthew Boyd. But every start, he's not going to be under a 3.7. So you just need to know from a pitching perspective, it's going to be very difficult to predict the variance that's happening. So from a draft attack perspective, I would wait on pitchers. I would wait to get them later on in the draft. You really want to get those offensive individuals where it's going to be a little bit steadier. You know what you're getting from these guys. Now, yes, there's going to be variance in the hitters as well. If you look at Cody Bellinger and potential 50-game windows where his average could hit, or a Christian Yelich, where 2 of the algorithms, I saw some individuals run online, and Yelich went everywhere from hitting like 405 or 410 all the way down to close to 300. Bellinger was up to like 390. He got down to like 260. He was a much broader window. Yelich's, consistency has brought his up from 280 up to 420 type of thing. But the window of almost 150 percentage points offensively is just as big as a 3-run differential on the ERA when you're looking at projections for where these guys are going to project. So 60 games really being a sprint. You don't know, does it benefit the guys who typically get out to hot starts because it's going to be the start of a season, even though it's the end of July and into the month of August? Do the likes of a Bryce Harper, who tends to have a strong April and May, those are one of his stronger months in the history of his career, do you project that because it's the first 100 to 150 at-bats of the season, that will correlate directly to the months of July and August, and Bryce Harper should be found to have an electric positive summer? Or do you look at the calendar year and you say Harper's good early in the year, but then when the dog days of summer hits, it gets a little bit hot, it gets a little bit warmer, he slows down, things slow down, so he should just be average when it comes to this summer. He should have a year just like 2019. Or do you look at the guys who, when the weather gets hot, they get hot? You know, we talked about long gone summer. Sammy Sosa said in the documentary that Chicago is cold, and early in the year he pretty much hates playing baseball there. But when the weather gets hot, Sammy gets hot, I believe was the quote as he was laughing or giggling on the show. And it was basically saying that I hate the cold weather, so make it warm. Okay, well, the warm weather guys, they're going to love it going right into the end of July, into August, into September. Are those the individuals that are going to be performing at a high level? But it's going to be a wacky fantasy season. Who knows what some of the breakdowns are going to be of how fantasy is going to be played, and head-to-head, can you do a 10-week sprint? Is it a week-by-week game? I mean, there's only 10 weeks. What if it's a 12-team league? Then not everybody can play each other if you're doing it week-by-week, because 60 games in 70 days, once a week. Again, it breaks down there. So is it a round robin? Is it a total points? There's a lot of different things a lot of commissioners are trying to figure out there in regards to fantasy baseball and their breakdown or logistics on how things are going to go. But it gets back to the original point, who people are playing on who you're drafting. And now that it's the East, Central, and West, does that change your perspective on the likes of a Garrett Cole, who's now going to face the AL and NL East, as opposed to the AL East, the AL Central, the AL West? You know, he's not going to have to face his old former team, the Astros, anymore, because they're not in the East. So does that change where you draft guys? Ultimately, I don't think you change any of the rankings. I don't think you look at maneuvering any of those information. You just need to know that consistency is going to be the key. And wrapping up the segment here, closing up the show, there are a few trends I think you should keep an eye on out there in regards to fantasy baseball. I don't know exactly how they're going to impact the game in regards to fantasy. I just know that changes are continuing to evolve, and the same way you played or managed in 2016 or 17 isn't going to fly or cut it in 2020. And I'm talking about the likes of the 3-batter minimum for relief pitchers. A lot of guys take high strikeout individuals, come in lefty-lefty individuals, maybe the likes of a Hader in Milwaukee potentially is somebody who you would think of this. Now they need to face 3 batters. In Philadelphia, there's certainly lefty specialists that are now going to have to face right-handed hitters. Does this affect their statistics ultimately? Because they can really only get left-handed hitters out. So yes, they're still going to get Yelich out, but then they got to face right-handed hitters, and now they're getting hit around for the next batters. Or are they only going to be brought in with 2 outs and not be used for the same amount of innings? How could this affect statistics? ERA, runs against, walks, innings pitched, appearances, hold, saves. This could change a lot on the tail end in the bullpen that we just don't know, because it's never happened. Nobody's ever seen a 3-batter minimum. So yes, you can run your algorithms, your sabermetrics to ultimately what you think and how it's going to affect these players, but nobody's seen it done before. So just keep an eye out on the bullpen and potential options or changes that you may need to make based on the 3-batter minimum. And along those lines is the closer by committee. Saves were way down across the league last year. You no longer have, hey, this guy is our closer, this guy is our closer. More and more teams are going by committee. Who's available that night? Who are we facing in this particular inning? This pitcher matches up best against guys A, B, and C. I don't care if they're up in the 6th inning, 7th inning, 8th inning, or 9th inning. This pitcher is going to face those guys when they come up. So tonight he's the closer. Tomorrow he's the 7th inning guy. Then you have those high leverage individuals that can go in at any time. Andrew Miller getting out here in the 7th inning. Now it's the 9th. Okay, it's a lefty, big spot in the 6th. We're going to you. But a lot of times closers by committee, so that save points that you get in fantasy baseball, they could certainly, be fading away if you don't get a lockdown closer. But then you go to the opposite side of the pitching spectrum, the opener. More and more teams. Sergio Romo, I believe, for the Tampa Bay Rays was an opener. If you get points for a starting pitcher, or if you get slots for a starting pitcher, look for the Rays because they go with the opener. Is he a starter? Is he not a starter? Well, he starts every time, but he only goes 2 to 3 innings, so that doesn't count as a starting pitcher. Can I use him in my relief role and get starting points for him? There's a lot of conversations around that. And then lastly, the catching position. Everybody knows it's the weakest position in baseball. The top-tiered individuals are much better than that of the rest of the pack. so they tend to go early in the draft. But catcher scarcity is quote unquote a thing within the fantasy baseball world. But some people that could benefit based on this delay, obviously everybody who's had an injury will now be back healthy, so there won't be any concerns from a fantasy perspective. The likes of Aaron Judge, Giancarlo Stanton, will they be healthy? Do I have to draft somebody else? Are they playing? Everybody like that should be back, as well as pitchers with innings limits. Thinking Spencer Howard in Philadelphia. There's a couple other young arms out there across the country that were on 80, 100, 120 innings limits. Well, now if you're only getting 12 to 13 starts, you go 5 innings a start. That's only 60, 70 innings on those young arms. So some of those players will be used more than others. And then from a fantasy perspective, take guys who can play multiple positions, because if there's no clear backup behind an individual, obviously they're the best because they're going to have to play because it's a sprint, so they're going to play every day. But if you have a platoon situation out there, or the potential for a Scott Kingery to play second one day, short another, third, then center, then left, and get himself in the lineup, they could bring a ton of value as utility individuals to your fantasy lineup. But hopefully you guys found that fun. Hopefully you guys found that entertaining. Once again, I am by no means an expert in fantasy baseball. I'm not in any of these dynasty leagues that have been going on for years where you draft minor leaguers and you keep these guys and this, that, and the third. I'm not into any of that with fantasy. I just thought it'd be a fun segment to talk about. We've talked about a ton of things here on the Baseball Podcast over the course of the last 2 months, but fantasy baseball hasn't been one of them. And that, of course, was due to not actually having baseball, so there's not really a lot to reference in regards to fantasy and actual baseball. So once baseball returns, that fantasy angle will come back a lot more often, and we'll reference it as to Fantasy Player of the Week, Top Performer. We'll be discussing all of that and much, much more. But that'll wrap it up here for episode number 199 of the Baseball Podcast. I am your host, Kevin Mahalik, as always. Before I sign off, I'll ask you one last time, head to social media, head to Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, head to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, all of the podcast platforms, wherever you're listening. Like, rate, subscribe, review. Again, it helps us continue to improve here within the podcast network. But happy Father's Day again to all the fathers listening out there. This is Kevin Mahalik with the Baseball Podcast. Have a nice night, everybody.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.